Hello, everyone. My name is Munzert. I'm from the Hertie School in Berlin. This talk is about citizens' preferences for online hate speech regulation. Joint work with Richard Tronmüller, Andy Guess, Pablo Barbera, and Yuan Yang. The core question we ask in this paper is what should we be allowed to post online? Or more generally, what should we be allowed to say? Now, this is, of course, an old and classic question, as the struggle over free speech and what is not allowed to say has been going on for millennia. Now, there's a twist, of course, and there's a reason why we present this at the core, which is that the key debate on free speech these days is about free speech online. So what should be done against potentially harmful speech and hateful speech online? So there are many recent government and platform efforts to combat hateful and offensive content on the internet. And we observe these developments with interest. What we also observe is that, in particular, platform action, so what current corporate platforms such as Facebook or Twitter do to combat hate speech or to tackle hate speech, really lacks democratic accountability. And to a certain extent, this also applies to government action. Now, coming from a research angle, there is classic evidence on variation in free speech preferences. So people think differently about free speech and whether and to what extent it should be regulated. Now, these findings don't necessarily translate into the online context. We believe that contemporary public opinion on what constitutes hate speech and what should be regulated is likely nuanced and context dependent. So it depends on what the actual speech is about, who says it, and whom we ask. In that sense, we think that learning about public preferences is, on the one hand, complex because of all these conditioning factors. On the other hand, it's relevant. It's relevant for designing regulations that are met by wide acceptance from general publics. Because at the end of the day, if the idea is to regulate what everybody is allowed to say or not allowed to say, and to what extent this should be tackled, people have to be aware of what the rules are and be willing to adhere to them. This is why we ask three key questions. Number one, what do citizens deem acceptable or unacceptable speech in online public discourse? So this is a question of perceptions. Number two, how do citizens want online speech to be handled and regulated? So this is a question about policy preferences. And three, we ask which individual factors determine these preferences and how cultural context matters in that regard. This is important because platforms and online speech takes place globally. So if preference is very online, this has implications for regulation and to what extent governments and platforms can learn from regulatory efforts in one context and translate them to another. So how do we tackle these questions? Here's the data and experimental setup. We work with an opt-in panel, web panel in the US and Germany. We've got about 1,300 respondents each. And what we did as part of a larger project was to run multiple waves in 2018 and 19. And in one of these waves, we embedded an experiment, which then took place in early 2019. All of this was pre-registered at eGAP, and you can check out our pre-registration plan under the link you see here. Okay, so how to measure preferences for online hate speech regulation? That's a key challenge. We believe that on the one hand, you can ask people in a rather abstract manner, what should we do? Should we regulate online hate speech in one way or the other? We believe that abstract questions are of limited use because one case is not like the other. So preferences are likely linked to what is concretely said and who says what to whom. So the idea was to build a measurement device that takes into account these conditionalities. And what we did was to construct social media vignettes that mimicked snapshots from Facebook posts. What we then did was to randomize content and context features in these posts. So what is said on the one hand and who says it to who. The respondent then takes the role of a content moderator and arbiter, sees a couple of these posts, in our case, 8 in total, and then decides A, how do these posts look like to the respondent, and B, what should be done to these posts or to the sender. So here you see a couple of examples of the posts we used, and there were like thousands of them, but like we then sampled from our universe of artificial posts. Focusing on the top left, you see a target, Nadim Shakir, who states, "I support feminism." And in response to that statement, we have the potentially controversial content and message of interest, in this case posted by a sender called Rashid Farah, who says, "Most women are stupid animals." And in this case, the target then responds with, you could call it counter-aggression. You see in the like 4 example posts that there is quite some variation of like who says what to whom, what topics we cover, and so on. What is key is that the element marked with the red arrow is the one that should be evaluated and rated by the respondent. Now, what did we vary? Quite a couple of attributes. So the issue at stake. So you saw an example on like women being attacked, but we also looked at Muslim immigrants being the group of being attacked, and then the ideological left and the ideological right. We had various target and sender identities to test whether like who says what or who is being attacked matters for respondents. And then the sender's message really varied across like a whole spectrum of potentially offensive and hateful content. So we have violence, we have insults, we have discrimination, and we have vilification. And in all of these cases, 2 levels, so a moderate and an extreme version. And then, as I showed you on the previous slide, the target could react by a counter-aggression, but also by like appealing to norms, saying that like civil discourse is important, for instance. But also the target could ask for platform action by blocking the sender or reporting it to the platform. So what do we find? First of all, some descriptives. Looking at the evaluation of like the hatefulness of the posts we showed to respondents, we see there is quite a bit of variation. So we have like both a substantive fraction of posts that are viewed as extremely hateful, but also as non-hateful at all, and everything in between. There are some like contextual differences or like country differences, but they are not that big. In terms of actions preferred to be taken by the platform provider, we generally see that respondents hesitate to support draconian penalties. Like the modal choice here is that no action should be taken, at least in the US. Deleting the post is also a popular option, but like a permanent ban is really not very popular as an option, even in extreme hate cases. In terms of further action, like the hesitation becomes even more apparent. So hardly any respondents want the sender to go to jail or being fined, although there's some interesting country differences, which might be rooted in the fact that in Germany, fines for hate speech are much more common than in the US. Job loss is also not very often preferred by the respondents in any of the cases. So again, like no further action is really by far the most popular choice here. Now, what drives these perceptions and preferences? With regards to the perceptions, we can look at the category of the message, being it like a violent or insulting or vilifying or discriminating message. And we see that like violence tops it all. So like a violent attack is really like most likely to be perceived as being offensive or hateful. The patterns are really very similar for both outcomes. Topic also seems to play a role. So when it is about potentially vulnerable groups or potential minorities, like the perceived offensiveness and hatefulness is higher. When partisan groups are attacked, such as liberals or conservatives, we don't see much of an effect. The ideology of the sender and the target, interestingly, doesn't play that much of a role. Neither do the replies of the target or the addressing scope, which is kind of interesting. So people seem to mostly focus on the content of the message. And you see the pattern is very similar when we move on to the other outcomes, which is like preferred actions by the platform or by law enforcement, for instance. Again, like the more violent, the more insulting a post, the more likely the respondents say like this should be deleted or blocked and so on. But again, like contextual features don't seem to matter much here. On the other hand, we see some very interesting variation across respondent characteristics. So in our samples, respondent features mattered a lot, or were to a certain extent predictive of like how offensive or hateful posts were perceived, and this also applies to the action being preferred to be taken for a post. A couple of interesting patterns to focus on here. And this is a very consistent finding, and also is consistent with findings in the literature, females are more likely to perceive a post as being offensive or hateful than males. To a certain extent, this also applies to like the higher educational strata. And we have an interesting ideological difference being that the right is substantively less like affected by these posts than the left. And notice that we have quite some balance in the post regarding the content. So this is an interesting finding. On the other hand, hate speech experience, so personally being exposed to hate speech online or having experienced hate speech online, doesn't really matter, which is kind of surprising. There are some interesting in-group and out-group effects. So what you can do is basically interact respondent characteristics with sender and target characteristics. And what we see here is a couple of things. Most important, and you see that down here in the topic field, is that like here we distinguish between respondents being on the left, like self-identifying as being left or left-leaning versus right or right-leaning. And while there's a general tendency to like perceiving things as being more offensive or more hateful for the left, this is like even truer or like more so the case when the topic is liberals, which is like some sort of like in-group reaction, but also women and Muslims being attacked. So left-leaning or like left self-identifying respondents are more offended by that than conservatives. When the target is a liberal or a conservative, like there, the differences do not really matter that much. So again, like it's mostly about the topic and less about sender and target, interestingly. To sum up, the type and the degree of hate speech matters. This is maybe a trivial finding, but it's also interesting descriptively to see that we can show that like the more extreme the violence and the insults, the more people perceive it that way and are also willing to take action, right? So there is some nuance, right? So there is like hate speech is not hate speech, right? So there is more severe and less severe hate speech, and this matters for preferences and perceptions. In that sense, content also matters. Some topics, in our case, hate speech against women and Muslims, is perceived as more problematic than others, such as hate speech against partisans. The message context seems to be less important, so the sender and the target attributes that we used had little effect on the outcomes, which is an interesting finding, right? On the other hand, the preferences varied systematically across citizen characteristics. So robust finding we have across the context we study is that the sensitivity for like offensive and hateful messages is higher among females than among males, higher among highly educated versus low educated, and higher among the political left versus the political right. I've shown you some evidence for identity that matters. So there's some evidence for bias in favor of people's own group identity, although it's not that strong as we probably expected it to be. And then there's an additional finding I didn't show you directly, but like we wondered what happens when you like expose people to all these hateful messages. And like we embedded this conjoint or like vignette experiment in another experiment where we randomly check like pre and post these tasks to what extent people support the free speech norm. And it turns out that like once people are exposed to all these messages, their support for the free speech norm goes down. That's it for now. So thank you. Looking forward to the panel.